Hello, and welcome to Connected With Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments, and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Tom Evans, a private equity M&A partner in Latham & Watkins' London office. In this episode, we dig into how regulatory and legal developments in the cannabis industry have opened the door to the prospect of significant PE investment. To do that, I'm delighted to welcome fellow partner from the Brussels and Paris offices, Eveline Van Keymeulen. Eveline has extensive experience advising on cannabis and hemp-based product regulations and brings a wealth of insight into the sector. Eveline, thanks very much for joining us.
Hello, Tom. Glad to be here.
Great. And tell us what's changed. How has the cannabis industry shifted from a no-go area, really, for PE investors to now what is an attractive prospect?
That's a good place to start, Tom. As you say, in years gone by, the prospect of significant PE investment in the cannabis industry would have been unthinkable for many. However, regulatory and legal developments have created opportunities for medical cannabis businesses and also legalized new non-medical cannabis applications in many jurisdictions.
Interesting. And so you noted in your PE Views article that you co-authored that according to Pitchbook, buyout firms invested $3.5 billion into the cannabis sector in 2021 across 200 or so transactions. That shows a significant appetite for deals.
Yeah, you're right. The numbers are notable. This growth in interest stems from the fact that PE firms in certain jurisdictions now have scope to embrace growing medical and consumer interests. Though we should note that in some jurisdictions, such as the US, evolving legal restrictions continue to challenge investors.
Okay, so let's talk first about those jurisdictions that are exploring legalization. What should our listeners know, Eveline?
Well, in Europe, medical cannabis is essentially regulated at a national level. So in 2017, Germany legalized medical cannabis, followed by the UK a year later. And several other countries are now considering whether to follow suit, including France, Ireland, Denmark, all of which have initiated pilot projects to explore legalization. For example, the acquisition of Nurex Farm, one of the first European pharmaceutical companies to include medical cannabis products in its portfolio, demonstrates increasing sponsor and investor appetite for companies pursuing authorized medical applications of otherwise restricted products, including cannabis.
Interesting. So increasing legalization across Europe. And so are we also seeing an increase in medical uptake in those jurisdictions as well, Eveline?
Yes, that's right, Tom.
And then if we look from Europe across the pond to the US, how does the current regulatory and legal situation there shape up?
Well, US federal law considers certain forms of cannabis to be a controlled substance with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. This renders distribution illegal at federal level, even though some states have legalized medical or, in some cases, recreational uses. So consequently, federal enforcement risks mean that investors have largely shied away from businesses involved in the sale or distribution of certain forms of cannabis or related products. A recent amendment to federal law effectively removed hemp, which under US law may also include CBD, from the definition of a controlled substance. But hemp remains subject to regulation and other restrictions. For example, CBD is currently prohibited from being marketed in food and dietary supplements, even though products containing CBD are widely marketed and enforcement has been pretty inconsistent. However, federal legislation has been proposed to loosen these legal restrictions.
And just one point before we go on, Eveline, what does CBD mean for those of us less familiar with the industry?
CBD is cannabidiol. It's the non-psychotropic substance of the cannabis or the hemp plant.
Got it. And so that is an interesting comparison between the current state in Europe and the US. Inevitably, investors will be keeping a close eye on developments in both jurisdictions. So then what about the wellness side of the industry? You detailed in the article that the legal developments that have paved the way for the use of hemp-derived CBD also have implications for the wellness industry.
Right, absolutely. There's a booming wellness business within the cannabis industry. The use of hemp, in a way, has been authorized in Europe for decades. But until recently, the use of hemp-derived CBD in, for example, cosmetics and food was prohibited in Europe, as CBD was considered a narcotic as a cannabis extract. So it's worth noting that, nevertheless, plenty of products were available and enforcement was infrequent. But then in November 2020, the European Court of Justice took a significant step towards softening the EU position, ruling in favor of the French retailer Cannavape that CBD was not a narcotic and could, of course, subject to the applicable regulations, be marketed across Europe. And that ruling paves the way for really the development, the sale, and the distribution of CBD products in Europe, and enables many companies, especially those in the cosmetics and the food and beverage sectors, to invest in CBD-based products. That being said, the use of CBD in food and beverages still requires a novel food authorization. So investors are eagerly awaiting the first European Food Safety Authority opinions, which were originally expected in early 2022, but have unfortunately been delayed following a recent statement made by EFSA.
Wow. It sounds like the next 12 months is going to be an interesting period to, decide what we can munch on. Let's focus on then deals that we're doing for private equity investors and what the key issues are that investors should be aware of. So things, I guess, like money laundering, Eveline.
That's a very good question, Tom. Direct fund restrictions on cannabis-related investments are not that common, but moral and legal investor concerns can arise, and local laws applicable to investors and their portfolio companies will also require careful diligence. In particular, the possession and the supply of cannabis for recreational purposes remains a criminal offense, for example, in the UK, but in many other jurisdictions as well. And therefore, financial proceeds, even when those proceeds are legally generated, may be deemed criminal property. For example, PE investors deriving profits from drug-related products, which may be lawful overseas, could face money laundering risks in the UK and elsewhere.
So the takeaway here is that firms should consider risk management around this issue and the potential for ring fencing of any profits. Is that fair?
Yes, exactly.
One final question from me. So for PE firms considering investments in the cannabis industry, what would you say is the outlook on exit opportunities and active growth? So we work with a firm on an investment and then they're looking to exit it in the usual 4 to 7 years.
Well, following FCA clarification of the rules surrounding access to London Stock Exchange listings in late 2020 and then additional clarifications in July 2021, several medical cannabis companies have already listed, underlining a pathway to exit as cannabis investment moves into the mainstream. Of course, as with any new sector, illegal cannabis comes with gray areas and pitfalls, but it may offer really high growth opportunities for PE, depending on the jurisdiction.
Interesting. Thanks very much, Eveline. It's been brilliant talking with you. Thank you for sharing your insight on the cannabis sector and the attractive PE opportunities available in many jurisdictions.
It's been a pleasure, Tom. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archive episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast, please email us from the links located in the show description. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 1271 Avenue of the Americas, New York, New York, 10020. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.